Hey everyone. Love is supposed to be eternal, unbreakable, a force that withstands the tests of time, distance, and hardship. That's what I believed. That's what I had with Emily. Or at least, that's what I thought. My name is James Carter. I am a U.S. Marine, 32 years old, born into a family where honor, loyalty, and commitment were not just values, but an unspoken code we lived by. My father was a Marine before me, and my grandfather before him. I grew up with discipline ingrained in my very soul, but I was never just a soldier. I was also a man who loved with every fiber of his being. Emily and I were high school sweethearts, the kind of love story that movies try to capture but never quite get right. She was my everything, the girl who made my heart race every time I saw her, even after years together. She was the first girl I kissed, the first girl I ever loved, and the only one I ever wanted. I still remember how we met. It was sophomore year, and I was the classic all-American athlete. Varsity football, track, the works. She was the girl who sat in the back of the classroom, doodling in her notebook, lost in her own world. Her golden hair cascaded over her shoulders, and her blue eyes held the kind of depth that made you want to drown in them. One day, fate, or maybe just dumb luck, decided to push us together. It was a cold autumn afternoon, the air crisp with the scent of falling leaves. I was running late to class, rounding the corner too fast, and I crashed right into her. Books went flying, papers scattered everywhere, and before I even had time to react, I found myself staring into those breathtaking eyes. "Watch where you're going, Carter," she had snapped, but there was a smirk playing at her lips. "Maybe you should watch where you're standing," I shot back, trying to play it cool, even though my heart was hammering against my ribcage. That was how it started. From that day on, she was in my every thought. I made excuses to see her, to talk to her, to make her laugh. And when she finally agreed to go out with me, I just knew, that she was the one. We spent our high school years wrapped in each other, sneaking out at night to lay under the stars, talking about our dreams, and making promises of forever. We were reckless, young, and so madly in love that nothing else in the world mattered. I still remember the way she used to look at me, like I was her whole universe. When I enlisted in the Marines after graduation, she was the only person who didn't try to talk me out of it. Instead, she held my hands, looked me in the eyes, and told me she was proud of me. "I'll wait for you, James," she had whispered, pressing a kiss to my lips the night before I left. "No matter how long it takes, I'll always be yours." And I believed her. For years, our love withstood the distance. I wrote her letters from overseas, sent her pictures, called whenever I could, and every time I came home, it was like nothing had changed. She was there, waiting with open arms, her love unwavering. But love is a fragile thing. And sometimes, no matter how strong you think it is, it shatters when you least expect it. The 14th of February, Valentine's Day, a day meant for love, for reaffirming the promises we made to each other. I had been granted an unexpected leave, 2 weeks back home. It was perfect timing. I wanted to surprise Emily, to show up at our house unannounced, with flowers in hand, and remind her just how much she meant to me. She had no idea I was coming. I spent the entire flight home thinking about her, about the way she would smile when she saw me, about how I would wrap her in my arms and whisper how much I had missed her. I imagined every detail, how I would take her out to dinner, how we would make love like we hadn't seen each other in years, how we would stay up all night talking about everything and nothing at all. But life had other plans. When my plane landed, I didn't call her. I didn't text. I wanted the moment to be perfect. I stopped by a florist, picked out a bouquet of deep red roses, her favorite, and drove home, excitement bubbling in my chest. As I pulled into our driveway, I noticed the lights were on. I smiled to myself. She was home. Quietly, I let myself in, careful not to make a sound. The scent of her perfume still lingered in the air, And for a moment, I just stood there, breathing it in, feeling like I was finally where I belonged. Then I heard it. At first, it was just a soft moan, a sound I knew all too well. I froze, my heart pounding in my ears. Then another moan, louder this time, followed by a deep, guttural groan. A man's voice. Number. The bouquet slipped from my fingers, petals scattering across the floor like remnants of something broken. I took a step forward, then another. My legs felt like lead, my stomach twisting into a knot so tight I thought I might be sick. The bedroom door was slightly ajar. I reached for it, my fingers trembling as I pushed it open. And then I saw them. Emily. My Emily. Naked, writhing beneath another man. Not just any man. Brian. My best friend. The betrayal was like a knife to the gut, twisting deeper with every ragged breath. My body went cold, my mind blank. For a moment, the world around me blurred, like I was watching someone else's nightmare unfold. Then Brian looked up, his eyes locked with mine. And suddenly, reality slammed back into me like a freight train. A surge of white-hot rage exploded inside me. I had faced war. I had seen death. I had endured pain beyond imagining. But nothing had ever felt like this. I wasn't going to walk away. I clenched my fists, stepping fully into the room. Emily gasped, scrambling to cover herself, her face drained of color. Brian froze, his expression shifting from pleasure to sheer terror. The air was thick with the scent of sex and betrayal. I exhaled slowly, steadying myself. Every instinct screamed at me to lunge, to break Brian's face, to make them both feel the kind of pain that was ripping me apart. But I wasn't just a man in love anymore. I was a Marine. And Marines don't lose control. I took another step forward, my voice low, dangerously calm. Well, I said, my eyes burning into them. Don't stop on my account. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. The kind that wraps around you like a noose, pulling tighter with every second. Emily sat frozen on the bed, the sheets clutched desperately to her chest, her face a ghostly shade of white. Brian, my so-called best friend, looked like he had seen death itself. And maybe, in that moment, he had. I could feel the heat of my rage boiling beneath my skin, every muscle in my body coiled like a spring ready to snap. But I didn't, because I was a Marine, because I had seen men break under pressure, had witnessed fear in the eyes of the enemy, had learned the kind of discipline that could save a life, or take one. And right now, Brian and Emily were staring at me, as if I was the enemy. I took another step forward. Brian moved first, scrambling off the bed like a coward, grabbing his jeans from the floor with shaking hands. James, man, listen. I cut him off with a sharp laugh. A bitter, humorless sound that even surprised me. Listen? My voice was calm, dangerously so. To what? To you trying to explain why you're fucking my wife in my bed? Emily flinched at my words, her lips parted, but no sound came out. Brian opened his mouth again, but I wasn't done. You know, Brian, I said, stepping closer, we've been through a lot together. We played ball together, went to war together. I would have taken a bullet for you. I tilted my head, looking him up and down. Hell, I almost did. And this? This is how you repay me? Brian's breathing was shallow, his hands shaking as he tried to button his jeans. James, it's not what you think. Another sharp laugh escaped my lips. Oh? Because what I think is that you two have been screwing behind my back while I was overseas, serving my country. I turned my gaze to Emily, who was still sitting there, silent. Am I wrong, Emily? She swallowed hard, her fingers digging into the sheets. Her blue eyes I had once drowned in, were now filled with something I couldn't quite place. Was it shame? Guilt? Fear? James, she finally whispered, her voice cracking. Save it. My voice cut through the air like a blade. I don't want to hear some half-assed excuse. But I needed something. I needed an answer. I turned to Brian again. How long? Brian hesitated, then looked at Emily. I caught that silent exchange between them. The way his eyes searched hers for permission, a sickening feeling settled in my stomach. I stepped even closer, my presence towering over him. I said, How long? A few months, he admitted, voice barely above a whisper. I clenched my jaw so hard I thought my teeth might shatter. A few months? I repeated, letting the words settle. While I was gone? While I was writing letters to her every night? While I was dreaming about coming home to her? Emily let out a choked sob. I never wanted to hurt you, James. I turned to her sharply. Then what the hell do you call this? My voice rose, echoing through the room. You didn't want to hurt me, but you did. And not just with him. Emily buried her face in her hands. Brian took a cautious step toward me. James, man, I swear, I moved before I could think. My fist connected with his face so hard that the sound echoed through the room. Brian stumbled backward, hitting the nightstand, knocking over the lamp. He groaned in pain, clutching his jaw. Emily screamed, James, stop! But I wasn't done. I grabbed Brian by his shirt, yanking him up, my face mere inches from his. You don't get to call me man, I snarled. Not after this. He was shaking. I shoved him back, my body trembling with restrained fury. Get out. My voice was low, cold, final. Brian didn't need to be told twice. He grabbed his shoes, tripping over himself as he bolted toward the door. Emily watched him go, her lips trembling. Then, for the first time since I had walked in, she looked up at me. Really looked at me. James, she whispered, please, let me explain. I stared at her. The woman I had loved since I was 16, the woman I had built my life around. And at that moment, I realized something. I didn't know her anymore. Go ahead, I said, my voice devoid of emotion. Explain. She swallowed hard, her hands twisting the sheets. I was lonely. I let out a humorless chuckle. Lonely? I repeated. So you decided the best way to deal with that was to sleep with my best friend? Tears streamed down her face. James, you were gone. For so long. And I didn't know how to cope. I folded my arms, waiting. She took a shaky breath. At first, it was just talking. Brian was there. He understood me. He listened. And then it just happened. I clenched my fists again. It just happened. As if cheating was some accidental occurrence, like tripping on the sidewalk or spilling coffee. And that makes it okay? My voice was ice. She sobbed. No, it doesn't. I know that. I know I hurt you. But I love you, James. I swear I do. I stared at her, feeling absolutely nothing. Love? I said, shaking my head. Love doesn't do this. She reached for me, but I took a step back. James, please, I'll do anything. I'll prove it to you. I looked at her, really looked at her, one last time. You already did, I said quietly. I turned and walked out of the bedroom, out of the house, out of the life I had built with a woman who was never mine to begin with. The night air was cold against my skin as I stepped out of the house that no longer felt like home. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but the rage still simmered beneath the surface, threatening to consume me. Everything I thought I knew had shattered in an instant. The woman I had built my life around, the one I had dreamed of growing old with, had betrayed me in the worst way possible. And Brian, my best friend, my brother, in all but blood, had been right there beside her. I climbed into my truck, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I could still hear Emily's broken sobs from inside, but I refused to turn back. I wouldn't let myself. Not this time. I didn't go to a hotel. I didn't call anyone. I just drove. The road stretched ahead of me like an endless void, and I welcomed it. But my mind wouldn't let me rest. Every moment replayed in my head like a nightmare on loop. The way Brian had looked at me, the panic in his eyes, the way Emily had clutched the sheets, trying to hide her naked body from the man who had spent his life worshipping her. I had survived war. I had seen men die, had lost brothers in arms, had faced down the enemy without fear. But this cut deeper than any wound I had ever taken. At some point, I pulled into an empty parking lot near a closed diner. The neon sign flickered in the distance, casting a weak glow over the cracked asphalt. I turned off the engine and just sat there, my head resting against the steering wheel. I thought of my father. He had been a Marine, just like me, and he had loved my mother with the kind of devotion I had always admired. If he were here now, what would he say? A man's strength isn't in his fists, James. It's in the choices he makes when the world tries to break him. I exhaled slowly. I had already thrown a punch tonight. That had been my instinct, my rage spilling over. But what I did next, that would define me. I reached for my phone, and I called my lawyer. The next morning, I met with Jason Holloway, my attorney. He had been handling my affairs since I started my military career, and when I told him what had happened, he didn't ask unnecessary questions. "You want to file immediately?" he asked, his expression unreadable. "Yes," I said without hesitation. "No reconciliation, no discussion. I want this over with." Jason nodded. "New York is an equitable distribution state, which means—" "I know what it means," I interrupted. "She can have the house. I don't want it." He raised an eyebrow. "That's a big asset to walk away from, James." I let out a humorless laugh. "It's just a building. It stopped being a home the moment I found her in bed with another man." Jason leaned back in his chair, studying me. "Are you sure about this? You're entitled to half of everything." I shook my head. "I don't want anything from her. I just want her out of my life." "All right," Jason said. "I'll draft the papers. Given the circumstances, I doubt she'll contest it." I stood, shaking his hand. "Make it fast." I went back to the house later that day, not to argue, not to fight, just to get my things and end it. Emily was waiting in the living room when I walked in. Her eyes were red, her face pale. She looked like she hadn't slept. "James," she started, but I held up a hand. "Don't," I said. "I'm not here to talk. I'm here to pack." She flinched but nodded. Can we just sit down, please?" I ignored her and walked past her to the bedroom. My hands were steady as I packed my duffel bag, taking only what mattered: my clothes, my medals, a few personal items. I didn't take the wedding album. I didn't take any pictures of us. When I walked back out, Emily was standing in the doorway, her hands clasped in front of her. "I signed the divorce papers," she said softly. I nodded, not looking at her. "I know you hate me," she whispered. I finally met her gaze. "No, Emily, I don't hate you." I paused. "But I don't love you anymore either." Her face crumpled. "James, But I didn't wait to hear the rest. I walked past her out of the house and didn't look back. The next few months were a blur. The divorce was finalized quickly, and I threw myself back into work, volunteering for every mission, every deployment, anything to keep my mind occupied. But at night, when everything was still, the memories crept in. Not of Emily's betrayal, but of the love we once had, the late-night drives, the whispered promises, the way she used to curl up against me in bed, safe and content. I had loved her with everything I had, and it hadn't been enough. For a while, I thought maybe that meant I wasn't enough. But love isn't about being enough. It's about being right. And Emily was not the right woman for me. I realized that the night I met Olivia, she was a bartender at a small place near the base, someone who had seen enough heartbroken men to recognize one the moment I walked in. She didn't try to fix me. She didn't pity me. She just listened. And for the first time in a long time, I felt seen. I didn't fall for Olivia right away, but over time, she became my friend. my confidant, and eventually, my reason to believe in love again. 1 year after my divorce, I ran into Brian. He looked like hell, his face hollow, his eyes dull. Emily had left him. Ironic, really. I didn't stop to talk. I didn't need to. Some people spend their whole lives running from their mistakes. I wasn't one of them. I had made peace with my past, and I had found my future. Olivia and I got engaged 2 years later on a quiet beach, under a sky full of stars. And when she said yes, I knew. This time, I had chosen right.